about cryptographic protocols. Last class, we talked about cryptographic primitives. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these primitives to build something more complex. And so we've talked about some of the basic primitives and the distinct functions that they provide. So symmetric encryption provides confidentiality. Hash functions allow you to provide data integrity. Keyed hash functions, message authentication codes, message integrity codes, those provide both data integrity and source integrity, because then there's a secret that is shared that allows the receiver to say, oh, I know who sent that particular piece of data to me. And then we looked at asymmetric encryption, public key cryptography, and that can also be used for confidentiality and as well as data and source integrity. And so with these primitives, we can build protocols around them. And you'll see a myriad of protocols, cryptographic protocols that are built on top of these primitives. And you'll see iterative designs because someone will develop a protocol and people are like, hey, there's a problem with the source integrity part of this, or this doesn't ensure data integrity. And this is why you should be very cautious when you see someone home growing their own crypto and cryptographic protocols, because more often than not, you get it wrong the first time and the second time, and then potentially the third time. This is why we have so many different versions of things like TLS. Like we're on like the third or fourth version of it. And we'll talk about the progression a little bit at the end of this class when we get to it. Okay, so I'm going to start with just some examples of cryptographic protocols and how they're used, just to build you up with how you would apply these abstractions into a protocol. Now, last class, we did talk about a protocol like PGP on how you could use different symmetric key abstractions along with asymmetric key abstractions. So we're going to do more of that. I'm going to start with the most basic protocol, the authentication protocol. And this is how do I authenticate Alice and Bob? And typically in the internet, we use username and password. That's how we started. And so Alice would send her username and her password. It would be in the clear. And then Bob would like look at this and say, oh, okay, you are who you say you are. I'm going to allow you access to my system. So the problem with this is that it gives up both confidentiality. Well, it definitely gives up confidentiality, and it's subject to replay attacks. Not only do I have your credentials, anyone who can see this session can replay it as well. But unfortunately, this is how we initially built protocols such as Telnet and FTP. Now, these things aren't used anymore, but they were used, like, that's what I use all the time when I was in your seat. That's what I was using to get access to systems, Telnet and FTP. And this is actually what is used in HTTP basic authentication. And this is where if you see basic authentication being used, you should realize it's doing this. So here's an example. This was the very first authentication scheme that was built into HTTP. So the idea is that you would get a resource, and if that resource is protected by basic auth, and the server would have a config file that says, oh, this resource, if someone asks for it, make sure that they send a username and password, and only if that's correct do I give you access. And so this is how the protocol would work. Get a resource, server says, you know what, you have to authenticate because you're unauthorized unless you send a credential. And then the browser would pop up a little window that asks the user, hey, what's your username and password? And then you would enter it in. And then the protocol would basically take your username and password and base 64 encode it, and then attach it to this HTTP request header on the way back. Where's my pointer? Right there. And so this is a base 64 encoded blob that's basically your username and password. So we saw earlier, base 64 isn't encryption, that's encoding. And so this is basically insecure. So that is an example. So we're like, okay, I don't want to give out the password or the username in the clear. So the next thing that you might consider is rather than sending the password, I'm going to send a hash of the password instead. And that's what hash-based authentication does. And so instead of sending the password in the clear, I will take, for example, a SHA-3 hash of the password and send that instead. Now, Bob, on the other side, so that's what Alice does. Alice sends the SHA-3 hash of the password. And then Bob, because Bob has the password for Alice in the clear, Bob can recompute that hash and say, oh, this person knew what the original password was because that hash matches what I can generate. Now, the problem with this is that even though the password is confidential, an adversary can just eavesdrop on this session, pull out this hash, and then replay this thing in order to hijack Alice's account. So there is no protection against account hijacking in this case. This leads us to the third protocol, digest authentication. So how does this work? So Bob wants to make sure that the hash that Alice sends is fresh. That is something that Alice has computed in real time. And so he sends a random challenge. And this is sent to Alice in the clear. And then Alice is going to send a hash digest that includes the challenge and the password together, and then hashed with that well-known hash function. So this is a challenge, and this is the response, is what we're going to label this. And then Bob can verify, because Bob remembers the challenge that he sent, has Alice's original password, and can regenerate this hash. Now, the adversary, even though the adversary sees the challenge, the adversary, because they don't have the password, can't regenerate this hash, and then they can't do a replay attack on you. Okay, so this is confidentiality because the password is not revealed, and it prevents replay attacks because you have to respond to the random challenge. The only way you could do a replay is if you observe billions of challenges going by and then record all the hashes in response, and then you could do a replay. Question in the back. Oh yeah, I got an example right for you right in the next slide. So this pattern, this challenge response pattern, is used in a lot of authentication protocols because you need to make sure it's a fresh authentication to protect against replay attacks. So this is what HTTP went to after basic auth. They went to digest authentication. And so instead, when you grab that URL, the server on the way back, and we talked about nonces before, that's basically how a nonce is defined. You're like some random number that I generate, but then I remember. And so you see this nonce, it's just a bunch of random hex characters. So then you would that would be turned into bytes, and then you would then ask for the credentials. And then what would get sent back is a cryptographic hash that includes the nonce and the credentials of the client. And that's basically what this digest authentication is. You say, this is the username, this is the original nonce I was using, and this is the response. And because the adversary doesn't have the password, the adversary can't go from this nonce and username to generate an appropriate response that would actually pass the server's check. Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, so those are authentication protocols. The next set of protocols you might want to be considering are data integrity protocols. And so we talked about hash-based integrity and some of its issues. So let's walk through this. So say Alice wants to send Bob a file and sends this file. So the file is data, which is with the D, sends the data with a well-known hash of the data, and then sends it to Bob. So this is good in that it provides data integrity. If there is a bit that is flipped in the data, the fact that you sent that hash will mean that if Bob gets this payload and tries to regenerate the hash, the thing will be corrupt. And then you could say, hey, send that again. So that's data integrity. But Bob has no idea who sent this to him. Like anybody could send Bob some data and a hash of the data, and you wouldn't be able to identify who sent that. So that's that's one way of doing this. We talked about how we then developed these keyed hashes, these HMACs, to do source integrity. So here, Bob and Alice they somehow bootstrap and share a secret key. And when Alice wants to send Bob some data, she'll first send the data and then generate a keyed hash using this shared key with the data and sends this along with the data. And so in this case, Bob can take this payload, sees the data, pulls out the data, and then regenerates this HMAC using this shared key. And if this is validated against this data, if what he calculates matches what has been sent, then he can be sure that it was Alice who sent that piece of data. Okay, so you get data and source integrity using this mechanism, and this is being done with symmetric keys. So this already assumes that you have authentically distributed that symmetric key. Okay.
Really quick again, what is the HMAC?
It's a keyed hash. So rather than just doing a hash of the data, you combine the data with a shared key, and then you do a MAC on it. And the HMAC so MACs and HMACs are kind of equivalent. The HMAC is just a tiny, if you check back in the slides last class, it's just a tiny modification to allow arbitrary length keys in your keying scheme. Yep.
Sorry if you already addressed this, but how do you securely share that key?
Yeah, key distribution. We'll get to that. We did talk a little bit about how you could use Bob's public key. So when we talked about public key, private key, there is a way of distributing, of bootstrapping a symmetric key. And we briefly touched upon it in PGP. I'm going to revisit PGP in this context again, so that you can see there's many different ways of bootstrapping a symmetric key. We'll talk about Diffie-Hellman. We used RSA last class, and we'll talk about Diffie-Hellman later on.
So kind of like hash-based integrity, this also uses a well-known hash.
Yep. In fact, it'll use like SHA-3 and then append a key to it effectively. At the abstraction level, you can think of it that way. Okay. The next way you could do this is with digital signatures. And so with this, Alice has a public-private key pair. And I say the public one is plus, and then the private one is minus. You want to keep this hidden, so it's down low. You keep it on the down low, so that's why it's the minus. And then the K plus is like to promote it. So that's this nomenclature that I'm using in these slides. And I realize this is slightly different than the code labs. The code labs have nice graphics, but this is what these slides were constructed with. So Alice has her key pair, publishes her public key, and Bob gets a copy of that. And then Alice has some data to send. And so that data, D, is then signed with the private key, with her private key. And this is the K minus. If the data is large, if it's larger than the size of the key, then she must take a hash of the data and sign that instead. And that's what we talked about with PGP. So she sends the signature along with the data. So here is the data she's sending, and let's just assume that this data is less than the key size, and then signs with the private key that data. And then Bob, on the other side, with Alice's public key, can verify that this signature matches this particular data that was sent. And then Bob gets data and source integrity via these asymmetric keys. Okay, so that's just a different way of getting the data and source integrity using the public key, private key construction.
This one always confused me with how the public key would be able to verify that.
Yeah, so I briefly touched upon this last class. If you remember the exponentiation in RSA, I showed how RSA did that, where instead of taking the private key as the exponent first and then the public key, you do the reverse. So yeah, the math, if you're really interested in the math underneath the crypto class. But yeah, that slide just briefly touches upon this as well. Okay, so all of those data integrity protocols, if you saw, they had nothing to do with confidentiality, right? All of that stuff was done in the clear. All that data was sent along with the signature or with the HMAC. So you have to actually do both, right? Like you want confidentiality and integrity when you're sending messages back and forth. So that's the next set of protocols that we're going to look at. And the first, we're going to start with the symmetric key versions of this. We're going to say we're going to have a shared key, a shared symmetric key. And again, we'll talk about key generation and distribution in a minute. And then Alice is going to just encrypt the data that she wants to send with a shared key. Bob will get this encrypted payload and then decrypt the encrypted blob. And then you get confidentiality. So that's one way of doing data confidentiality. But the issue with this is that there's confidentiality, but Bob has no idea, well, doesn't really have an idea that Alice has sent this, even though it's using Alice's shared key with Bob. Any adversary could flip the bits here and then wreck your data integrity and basically source integrity because you're assuming Alice sent this, even though she didn't. So an adversary in the middle could totally twiddle with this, and you have no assurance on integrity on the other side. So that's the most basic data confidentiality protocol. We're going to build on top of this. So the other way, the next thing you could do is to try and do some authenticated communication that's encrypted, so authenticated symmetric encryption. And then you would, again, start with this shared key, K of AB, so they share the symmetric key. And then Alice is going to, again, use the shared key to encrypt the data to get confidentiality, just as before. But then what she'll do is she'll also send this HMAC, this keyed HMAC with this data. Now here, because anyone that tampers with this will corrupt this, this is where you're going to get the source and data integrity on top of the confidentiality. Okay, so that's basically what we have. Bob is first going to decrypt the data and see that the data is here. And then Bob is going to recalculate that HMAC. So it's going to regenerate that HMAC from this data and this shared key, and then compare that with whatever got sent along with this encrypted payload. So you get all three. You get confidentiality, data, and source integrity. Does that make sense? Okay. Just making sure I didn't lose anyone. A little bit.
I can rewatch that.
Yeah. Okay, so this can also be done with public key cryptography with asymmetric keys. This is what we had last class. This is that PGP thing that we had talked about. So Bob has a public private key pair. So the private key is K minus, and then the public key is K plus. And the most basic way of doing public key encryption is for Alice to get that public key of Bob. And then with if she has a bunch of data to send to Bob, she can generate a random symmetric key K and then use that key to encrypt the large payload, the data. So this is the symmetric key that's generated, the data that she wants to send, and then she encrypts the data with that generated key. Now, Bob doesn't have little k. And so Bob needs to figure out what little k was that Alice used. And so then what Alice does is that she encrypts this symmetric key, little k, with Bob's public key that she has. And then she sends both of these over. And this is what we did last class. Bob will get this payload, and Bob will decrypt first this symmetric key that was encrypted with his public key. And because he is the only one with the private key, He's the only one that can regenerate this symmetric key. Well, other than Alice. Alice had it to begin with. So now Bob's got this symmetric key. And then Bob can use that symmetric key to generate the data on the other side. Okay, so that's what we had last class with PGP. And you get confidentiality, but you don't get data or source integrity because Bob doesn't know who used all of this stuff, right? Anybody could have sent this. And so, and in addition, anyone could have flipped any of these bits, and there's no integrity check per se that says bits were flipped, right? You need hashes to do the integrity check in this case. Okay, so that is the first the first attempt. What is typically done is all three of these things. You do the encryption, the hashing, and the signing in order to get confidentiality and data and source integrity using asymmetric keys. So again, we have Alice and Bob. In this case, we need both key pairs. We need Alice, because we're trying to do authenticated communication, we need Alice to have a public and private key pair as well as Bob, and we'll see why. So they both have key pairs, and as part of their key pairs, they have to publish their public versions, right? So now Alice has Bob's public key, and then Bob has Alice's public key. So that's the next step. And then as before, this is from the previous protocol, you do the same thing. You generate a symmetric key randomly, you encrypt your data, this is what Alice does, and then Alice is going to take the public key of Bob and then encrypt the symmetric key. So this is exactly as we had before. But then she's going to do one extra thing. She is going to sign, using her private key, the hash of the data. This is a well-known hash of this, it could be a SHA-3 hash of the data straight up. She is going to sign that with her private key. So that is the modification. And what this does is on the other side, Bob is going to do what he did before, decrypt the symmetric key, and then decrypt the symmetric key with his private key, and then decrypt the data with the symmetric key. So those are the two steps that I just folded into one from the previous slide. And then as the final step, he's going to calculate based on the data that he got down here, he's going to calculate that cryptographic hash and then use that hash and Alice's public key, these two things, to then verify that this matches what the signature was. So in this case, you can then get confidentiality, data integrity, and source integrity. Yeah. Yeah. So when I said PGP in the previous class, that was just one part of PGP, not the whole thing. So I'm trying to scaffold you up. That's correct. That's a good catch. Yeah, we didn't talk about authenticated encryption last class because I wanted to get you to this point. So hopefully all of this notation makes sense. Like functionally, these are the pieces that you need. These are the primitives and how they're used in protocols in order to get confidentiality, data integrity, and source integrity. Okay, other questions about this before I go on to the next thing? Okay, so we had questions about, well, how do you distribute all of this stuff? Like, how do I distribute that shared symmetric key in a way that's secure? And before RSA, there was this Diffie-Hellman algorithm that basically bootstrapped asymmetric cryptography. And this basically revolutionized how we do communication. This is used everywhere now, this Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And so what is this? This is an alternate way. This is like the original way of using long-term public keys to agree on short-term symmetric keys. Up until this point, I have shown you the RSA way, where you encrypt you generate a symmetric key, you encrypt it with the other person's public key, RSA public key, and then you send it. The traditional way of doing key exchange is this Diffie-Hellman approach, and the security of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange is it relies on the difficulty of computing discrete logs. If this is ever broken, we got a lot of work to do. So this is where quantum computing, if you put quantum computing and you target Diffie-Hellman key exchange, you got to make sure you're trying to resist what it can do. Okay, this is a visual explanation using colored water for the intuition on how this thing works. If none of what I say makes sense, watch the YouTube video. It's kind of like the Khan Academy. There's only so much production quality I can put into my slides. Someone who really cares about explaining Diffie-Hellman key exchange has done this, which I prefer, but it takes a while to watch it. So that's why I'm not going to play it for you. This is the paper, though. This is the seminal paper. It's from 1976 that underpins all of this. If you want to read the original paper. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the actual math underneath. The Diffie-Hellman setup is to first publish two parameters, a well-known prime number and a generator number. And these two things will be used to produce the functions that allow you to get a shared key. So Alice starts out, so both Alice and Bob know P and know G. Alice starts out by selecting some random key. And so this is her private key, A. And so A is going to be in this notation, the red key. And then what she does is to generate her public key, she takes this generator number, takes it to her private key, modulo this prime number, and this will give her capital A, which is now this blue key here. So the capital A is the public key, the little a is the private key in this notation. Bob is going to do the same thing. Bob has a private key, which is little b, and that's his red key, and then calculates a public key, capital B, which is this generator to the little b power mod this prime number. Okay, this is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Alice and Bob publish their public keys in the clear. And so you see capital A, which is G to the A mod P, and capital B, which is G to the little b mod P, are sent in the public. So the adversary can see this now. And the adversary has these two values, capital A and capital B. And so Alice and Bob now have each other's public key. So this is Bob's public key. And Alice has her private key, and this is Alice's public key, and Bob now has her public key. Okay. So I should say the difficulty of this discrete log prevents anyone from seeing A or B from calculating little a and little b, right? This is necessary so that you can't go from the public key to the private key easily. So I failed to mention that initially. Okay, so then they have each other's public key. What they can do is they can take each other's public key and raise it to their private key. And what they're going to do, this operation generates G to the AB mod P. And this is the shared secret key that they are then going to use. So this is what Alice does. She takes Bob's public key, raises it to her private key, and this turns out to be the same as G to the AB mod P. Bob is going to do a similar operation. Bob is going to take Alice's public key, raise it to his private key, and then take it mod P, and this is the same as G to the AB mod P. So this is now their shared key. Now the question is, someone in the public, can they also compute G to the AB mod P from just capital A and capital B? And so this is the question that you have to ask. And as it turns out, just from these two values, you can't do this. You can't take G to the A mod P, raise it to G to the B mod P, and be able to get G to the AB mod P. That just doesn't work. Okay, so this is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange that allows you to very nicely get this shared key for very, very little overhead, as it turns out. Okay. Random, yeah, you agree upon that random number, and that's part of your public function, and the generator is also random. Yeah. Okay, so I glossed over all the math, but like you can, if you really are interested in the math. I'm not interested in the math, so that's why I don't teach it. But like if you're interested in the math, I know there are some math focused people. We do have a cryptography class that gets into the number theory underneath this. And Feng Song is your guy. He knows that stuff like the back of his hand. Okay, so attacking this Diffie-Hellman key exchange. One of the ways to attack it is a person in the middle attack. And that's what we have here. We have this little adversary, this little evil Pac-Man person, for any of you who played Pac-Man before. So this is an evil entity in the network. I should say misguided entity in the network, the little Pac-Man. And so how is this attacked? So basically, an adversary in the network could intercept Alice's message to Bob in the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and then perform the Diffie-Hellman key exchange with Alice, substituting their own public key to generate that shared key. So Alice is thinking she's establishing a Diffie-Hellman key exchange with Bob, but the adversary is in the middle, hijacking this and rewriting that key exchange message so that it's their own. Then the adversary, after doing this and generating this shared key with Alice, can do the same thing to Bob. The adversary can initiate the Diffie-Hellman key exchange with Bob, and then get this shared key between themselves and Bob. And then the attacker can proxy the traffic that goes back and forth these two entities. So Alice sends a message using this shared key with the adversary. It gets encrypted. On the other side, it gets received, it gets decrypted, and then the adversary can change the message to M prime, and then encrypt M prime with a shared key to Bob. And then this M prime gets received by Bob and decrypted. And now you've got this tampered with message instead of the original one. So you have to find some way to protect this Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So you almost have to bootstrap a channel before you're doing the key exchange. And this is what TLS actually does, and SSH. Like they bootstrap a session and then they have to do the key exchange in an encrypted way to make sure that an adversary in the middle can't tamper with the key exchange and then hijack that connection. Okay, are there questions about Diffie-Hellman? I'm only really concerned about you understanding the abstraction that it provides you, the building block that it provides you. Okay, so the next, cryptographic protocols in the wild. We have enough. We know the primitives. We know the kinds of protocols we want. Now we can talk about actual ones. And I'm going to start with the one that everyone uses, TLS. So let's talk about TLS. The first thing that you want to do in TLS, that we should do all the time, is how do we distribute all of these public keys on the internet? That's like the basis for the key distribution problem, is the hard problem in security. We'll build all of this fancy secure stuff, but somehow we have to bootstrap trust in some entity in order to cascade, to build a secure protocol underneath. So how do we do this on the internet? How do I trust a particular destination? Like, where is the root of trust that I'm depending upon? Like when you go to a website, it's like, are you trusting the browser? Are you trusting the server? Or are you trusting some third party that you don't know about? It turns out for most people, we're trusting a third party that we don't know about. But we should know that we don't know about that third party. And that's what we're going to talk about now. The original way that we figured out how to trust people is through, this is PGP. We would generate a public-private key pair, and we take the public key and we print it on a business card, and we go to conferences. We would meet people face to face, and we would exchange public keys on paper. And so that's how you bootstrap trust initially. And so that's fine. So these are two examples of this. But how do I expand my circle of trust? Like I email way more people than I have met face to face. How do I actually bootstrap communication with them in a way that's trustworthy? And so one of the things that PGP talked about was building a web of trust. Have individuals sign each other keys and try and do this transitive thing where you have just a distributed graph of trust. And that's how they proposed to build up trust so that it encompasses everyone. Kind of like LinkedIn, right? Like where you sort of like build up a network and say, oh, you're like six degrees of freedom. I'll kind of trust you. But if you're like 2 degrees, because someone I know vouched for you, maybe I'll trust you a little bit more. So that was the PGP web of trust. But this doesn't work for arbitrary network connections over the internet. We got to do something else. And the problem is when we developed the internet, we did not care about confidentiality. We didn't care about message integrity. We didn't care about server integrity, identity, source integrity, or server authentication. And so all of the internet protocols had these problems to begin with. And so in 1994, when the World Wide Web was taking off, Netscape developed this secure sockets layer to try and address this for all of the application protocols that the internet was using. So this is why, well, this is where security started to get integrated into internet applications. This eventually evolved into something called TLS. So transport layer security is a generalization of SSL. And this is what underpins the security when you go to a site that has https:// in front of it. This TLS protocol is now ubiquitous. And it's ubiquitous because of 3 things. We now have hardware support that makes this fast. We realize that it's easy to break and subvert communications over the internet. And that's what the Edward Snowden revelations revealed to us. And then now we have free TLS certificates that are easy to get. So we have this thing called Let's Encrypt. And so now we have secure connections. And this is done via something called trusted certificate authorities and digital signatures. What underpins TLS are these things. And because we understand now the cryptographic primitives, we can now look at how we establish trust over the internet. The first thing I want to talk about are the certificate authorities. And these are the trusted third parties that everybody on the internet has put their trust in. And every CA that is out there that we trust has this highly secure, long-lived key pair, public key, private key pair. And it is up to the CA to keep the private key private. So this is our root of trust, that this thing is secret. And so this is the public part of this. And so what a CA will do is it will self-sign this public key with the private key to generate this root certificate. So this is the CA certificate. It's a self-signed certificate using this private key that says this is my public key. And assuming that this is private, this is going to be your root of trust. This certificate is embedded in every single web client and every single web server on the internet. Yep. It could mean a lot of things. So yeah, sometimes you'll visit a site and it'll be certificate expired or certificate invalid. And we'll talk about, there are expiration dates to these certificates. So you have to keep on renewing the trust. And it's soft, they need it to be a little bit soft because if that private key got compromised, you need a way of undoing the trust that everyone has put in it. And so timestamp expiration times will sometimes happen. Sometimes somebody will take a public key, a certificate for one site and try and use it to another. And because the names don't match, you'll also get these errors. And we'll talk a little bit more. Once we understand how their certificates work, you can now debug some of that now. Okay. So when the CA, say Alice and Bob are sites that want to communicate with each other, and they want to do this authentically. And so the certificate authority is in charge of verifying identities of people who want to be trusted and using their private key to sign the certificate of that entity. So in this case, Alice was like, hey, I want to be legit. I just brought up my website and I want to be protected by HTTPS. When users come to my HTTPS site, I want them to have the green padlock. And so what she'll do is she'll go and approach the certificate authority and say, hey, this is me, Alice, this is my site. Will you use your private key to sign my public key? So Alice generates a public key, private key pair, and then gives the CA the public key, say, please sign it, because I want you to vouch for me. And that's what's happening. She's asking the CA to use their signature to vouch for her so that she can get her own certificate to send to other people. And her certificate will have her public key and the signature of the CA validating that this public key belongs to her. So then she is the only one who can present this and then have a valid CA signature. And then Bob's going to do the same thing. Bob wants to be legit also, has a website, and also wants to do authenticated communication with Alice. So he has to do the same thing. When they want to communicate with each other, so Alice and Bob want to communicate, both of them have the CA's certificate, their original certificate, and has the CA public key. So when they want to communicate, Alice sends Bob the certificate, and Bob pulls out her public key, pulls out the CA's signature of Alice's public key, and then takes the public key in the CA's cert and verifies that, yes, this public key was used to sign this public key, and then it matches, that these two things match. Okay, so this is Bob verifying Alice's public key when Alice sends Bob the certificate. Alice needs to do the same thing. Alice needs to say, I don't know you, Bob, send me your certificate. And then Bob will also exchange his certificate. And this is how you get the mutual authentication going on either side. Okay. Okay, so what are in these certificates? They're basically the public key, the name of the principal who owns the associated private key. So if it's a website, it'll be alice.com for Alice's certificate, bob.com for Bob's certificate, and then the signature of the authority, of the certificate authority that binds the two. The last thing is the thing I mentioned in that previous question was an expiration date, right? You have to keep renewing this thing so that it just doesn't get, it's not trusted cruft on the internet. Like it's just not laying around forever, like this trust association. So it has an expiration date. Okay, so then with these certificates, this is how we do authentication on the internet. And this is we're gonna go through server authentication only. We're not going to talk about the client authentication piece, even though that's supported in TLS. It's rarely done using TLS certificates to authenticate the client. We're gonna go through a scenario where Bob, as the server, is trying to prove to Alice that he's legitimate. And so the question that the goal is getting Alice to obtain an authentic copy of this public key where she can trust that this thing is legitimate. And so what happens is the first thing is we have distributed the CA's public key to all the browsers and all of the servers serving websites. So this is public knowledge. And then CA's private key is kept secret. And then Bob asks the CA to sign a certificate containing his public key, and he provides to the CA some proof that he is legitimate. He is Bob.com. Now, initially over the internet, you would ask the CA to visit your business, visit your site, and then the CA would like, okay, you have a legitimate purpose. You are who you say you are. You've given me your letterhead. You're definitely Bob. So then I'm going to sign your stuff. So it used to be a brick and mortar operation. Now with Let's Encrypt, all you need as proof is that you need to prove you own the DNS record and the IP address that it points to. If you own both of those, then any CA, or Let's Encrypt, not any CA, Let's Encrypt in particular and several others will automatically sign whatever you ask them to sign. So that's the proof in this day and age for the in this day and age for Let's Encrypt. Then the CA is going to issue Bob a certificate that has his public key in it and then the CA's signature. When Alice asks to communicate with Bob.com, Bob is then going to provide this certificate. Now, with this certificate, because Alice has the public key of the CA here, Alice can verify that this signature is going to validate this public key. And then this is how Alice can be sure that the CA has vouched for Bob.com and that this is somewhat legitimate. But again, you're trusting certain things to have been done. This is your chain of trust, right? This has to be secure. This has to be done appropriately, and so on. That's a good question. You're always a step ahead, but yeah, that's a good. No, that's good actually. So that's the question that Alice is asking: is did a CA vouch for Bob? So I'm going to just briefly, before I get to your question, I'm going to briefly talk about, well, what's Alice's view of this thing? So Alice is going to connect up to Bob, and then Bob is going to send this certificate. And this certificate is going to be received by Alice, and she's going to verify that this, with the CA's public key, she's going to verify that this certificate is legitimate. And then we'll extract Bob's public key and then use this public key to bootstrap a shared key between herself and Bob. And in this case, it's done by generating a master secret and then encrypting the master secret with Bob's public key and then going back and forth, and then sending that to Bob. So master secret encrypted with Bob's public key. And then Bob will take his private key and decrypt that master secret and then generate some shared keys to then communicate back and forth using that master secret. And this is where you bootstrap this key distribution to then do the data encryption back and forth. Okay. So this is basically builds up on all of the primitives and the protocols. And you'll see things like SSH and TLS are basically constructions on top of what we just talked about here. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. And so this then allows you to do the encrypted communication with HTTPS. Okay, so then this is the result. Okay. But what could go wrong here? Take a second to read this. I pulled this from a bank, actually. This is a bank that my mom uses. And I saw this, I'm like, do you really want your money at this bank? But read this. And you're like, oh, wait, there's some red flags here. Because what this is doing, this is training users. Green means good, right? Now I realize security is complicated, but as soon as you market that green means good, the adversary's like, I need green, right? And that's basically what this is. So the green bar is your signal that the website has passed a sophisticated authentication process, basically Let's Encrypt, and is authentic, okay? So this is a problem. What about authentically bad sites, right? Yeah. Yeah, you get a certificate. Yep. Yep. So that's pretty like adversarial thinking. Yeah. Yeah. Bank of America, where rather than the O, it's a 0. Sure. Yeah. So this is a problem. We have conflated this green bar or the lock symbol with authentically good. But what does it actually mean? What does HTTPS actually mean? As it turns out, most people don't have a clue. So this was done 3 years ago, but I'm sure this has not changed at all. They could redo this survey. 30% will know that HTTPS only means that the information that is being sent is encrypted. What's worrying is that 12% of the people thought that it meant the site has been verified as trustworthy. And this gets back to your typo squatting thing, right? Like who verified that? The typo squat. Nobody did. And so this green padlock is now a tacit guarantee that the site is trustworthy for most consumers out there. And of course, the adversary knows this now. And so the adversary is like, okay, well, I'm going to use Let's Encrypt for all of my phishing attacks because I need that green padlock in all of my sites. And so this is where this statistic came from. Basically, in 2019, 26% increase in the use of malicious URLs that are being made to appear legitimate because everyone knows that HTTPS is secure. And so basically, this is an example. This is like one of the better examples. And like it's easy to fall for these things. Like I'm in security, but like I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, oh, isn't that kind of legit? I mean, they're getting close. So this is the one I particularly like because they had screenshots of this. This is what one campaign was doing to trick online shoppers to submit their payment card data. And so this is the site they forwarded people to. And you look, there's a padlock, payment dash MasterCard. I have seen many legitimate sites using URLs that look like that. So that's a problem. So how do you train your mom to say that ain't legit when you're already looking at it and say, is that legit? Look at it. So the only thing, what would you do? Like if you had to train your mom to say, don't enter, what would you tell her? Or your dad, or anyone who's much older than, who didn't grow up with the internet? What would you? Your MasterCard. Oh, that's true. Yeah. If it's a payment bank rather than a your other your on the client end bank. Yeah. Yeah. I could only say the only thing that I would look at this favorite icon. I was like, yeah, most banks have a fave icon, but that's easy to replace too. And you'll see that like it's really easy. Like we're entering our credit card numbers in a lot of different UIs. So then, yeah, it's really easy to spoof a payment site and get people to fall for it. And that's the problem here. Yep.
There was like a new thing that's happening recently where like the Google Chrome like web apps thing that doesn't show a URL bar popping up and showing
We'll get to that when we get to social engineering. Oh, yeah, there will be a whole bunch of this stuff when we talk about social engineering next week. But yeah, that's basically like consent grant phishing and then phishing within web apps, within the embedded WebKit browser of some of these apps. That'll be a thing that we talk about. And actually, Google just deprecated that. It actually wrecked one of my cloud labs. Well, it might wreck one of my cloud labs because they just disabled something. But yeah, this is because adversaries are like, oh, these are sweet mechanisms that people are now programmed to use. I am just going to make it look exactly like what they're doing. And this kind of consent grant phishing or social sign-on, like this is where, yeah, a lot of this adversarial stuff is being moved to that realm. Okay. Okay. One of the problems with certificate authorities is that you want to avoid a bottleneck or a single point of failure at the root, right? If you only had one certificate authority, then all of the requests would go to that one. And then you'd be like, what happens if someone breaks into that one? Then you're in trouble. Then everybody's in trouble, right? So typically, we have several of these what's known as top level CAs. And then the CA using those keys will sign a cert for a second level authority. And most of the signing work will be done lower, right? Because your most sensitive key should be used the least. And so even within Let's Encrypt has a hierarchy of keys. The master key is only used like once or twice to sign the second level keys. And then those second level keys are then used to do a lot of the signing for certificates below it. So that's the idea. But we have this tree, we have this basically chains of trust that come down from the CA. And we also have hundreds of CAs now. And so this goes back to the question is how many CAs does the internet trust? Turns out it's hundreds. And any CA can generate a valid certificate for anyone or any site, right? They have the private key that is associated with the public key that everyone on the planet has a copy of. And so they could sign whatever they wanted. And even if it's legitimate or not, get everyone to trust that that signature is legitimate. Yeah. Who vets the CA? Mozilla. Mozilla, and this is because Google doesn't want to be seen as controlling any of this. So typically Mozilla publishes a list and Google will follow. But yeah, this is a battleground actually. Like who gets to decide, like if a nation state wants to be a CA in order to control the communication to their citizens and is willing to do whatever it takes to hijack the communication, well then can Mozilla just say, I don't trust that CA anymore? This is something that's a policy thing for you to look at. I don't know if I'm going to get to the policy part of this class, unfortunately, because there's so much technical stuff to get through. So that question was, how many CAs do I trust? Well, you just go into your browser and look, or you can go into your operating system and look. The certificate authority store, that the sets of certificates that you trust are right in your operating system. So in the browser, you can go to privacy and security, go to the managed certificates, and you look at the certificate authorities that are in there. And then if you're using the operating system certificate store, you can see all of these places who have public certificates that you trust. Now, like the fact that we trust Equifax still should set some alarm bells off, right? They're the ones who just. Oh, okay, there's an old screenshot. Yeah. So maybe that's good. Yeah. Maybe, yeah, so that actually is doing things correctly. Well, they just spent $1 billion because of that data breach on security. So maybe you can trust them now. Okay, so then the question is, do you trust all of them? And then what happens if a CA is compromised, including its private key? And so these are all the cases where CAs have been compromised. These are the known cases. So 2011, Komodo and DigiNotar, that was breached. And as part of this, this was an Iranian CA. And then they thought this was nation state driven. They issued certs for Gmail, Yahoo, and all these other sites that for monitoring their citizens going out into the internet, right? Because if you can forge a certificate to Gmail, you can do a person in the middle attack on the communication through Gmail on your citizens. So that's what this one was. 2013, this was a misconfiguration, I believe, and Turk Trust was tricked into issuing a certificate for gmail.com. And so all these bogus google.com certificates were issued, and this allowed whoever generated them to point Google traffic over to a site and then appear legitimate to the people visiting that site. And it was a flawed process in this case. This was another one. This is a CA operated by the Indian government. And again, basically improperly issued SSL certificates for these domains. I think they were saying this was just for testing purposes. But I think that upset Google and Yahoo for sure. Even if you are just generating those certs and not using them, that made them mad. Here's another one. Again, impersonating Gmail and Google's homepage for, oh, this is the one for testing purposes. I don't know if they figured out the motivation for the 2014 one. And then here's one where they basically signed github.com certificates. They got tricked into signing these things. And so if you want to read a little bit more about this problem, this is a link for you to look at. Okay, so this all leads to certificate revocation. So we need to revoke the certificates to address any of these key compromises, because we're trusting this third party to sign and publish this list, and we're trusting that third party to keep their private key secure. And if it's not, if it's being tricked into signing random things, well, we need to say, well, revoke all of those signatures, or revoke the public key associated with all of those signatures. And so all software is typically programmed to check this, what's known as a certificate revocation list. What are bad certificates? And this is ones that you want to revoke before the expiration date. So, but like before the Equifax expiration date of 2018, say I wanted to revoke that one in 2017. This is where the CRL is used for. But then if you implement a CRL, what happens if as a client, you can't connect up to the place that's hosting the CRL? What happens if you can't download it? And so we'll talk a little bit later about doing this key exchange without certificate authorities. And this is going to be a preview. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get started again. I'm going to talk about these two things called forward secrecy and future secrecy. So what is this? So these two things are meant to address key compromise. So we talked about certificate compromise. What happens if you're communicating with someone and someone captures like a symmetric key that you're using in between yourselves? And so every protocol has to assume that eventually a key is going to get compromised and needs to recover from it. The first question you want to ask is, what is the impact if an adversary obtains a secret key being used to encrypt messages back and forth between the client and the server? Can the adversary, with that key, encrypt any of the prior encrypted messages that were used in that protocol? This property is referred to as, does the protocol have forward secrecy, meaning that forward decryptions can't decrypt earlier ones. I mean, this terminology is kind of hard to digest, but I don't make the terms. I only communicate them to you. The other thing that you have to think about is if someone has captured a secret key right now, can they decrypt future encrypted messages that they see? So this is future secrecy. Can I protect future secrecy or post-compromise secrecy? So these are the two things, the two properties that we're going to talk about here and how it's implemented. Then the other question is, how long can the adversary remain after being discovered? And this more refers to future secrecy than forward, but you need to be able to revoke keys, and you need to be able to have a life cycle on your secret keys. Key rotation is what we call it in security terms. You need to be able to rotate those things so that the capture of one key doesn't lead to persistent capture across everything. Okay, so I'm going to first address forward secrecy, and there is this term called perfect forward secrecy, which is like, I still don't understand why they called it perfect forward secrecy. Maybe some of you can do some reading and be like, oh, I know what the perfect is. But the idea of perfect forward secrecy is to limit the impact that a private key being captured and decrypting prior messages has on being able to do so. So there, I'm going to show this in an example because I just covered TLS. This is TLS 1.2, and you have an adversary in the middle who is capturing all of the traffic being sent between Alice and Bob. And so Bob, and again, this is TLS, so it's Bob with the private key public key pair, the certificate. So the way this TLS works is Alice does the client hello, Bob sends the certificate, the public key. Alice generates a random symmetric key, this green thing, and then encrypts that secret, that key using Bob's public key, and then sends the encrypted symmetric key with Bob's public key back over to Bob. So that's the encrypted key. And then Bob will decrypt this thing using his private key and then generate this symmetric key again. So at this point, both Bob and Alice have a shared secret key, this green, and then Bob's going to use this key to encrypt the data and then generates the ciphertext encrypted by this key, sends that over to Alice. So that encrypted payload is sent. Alice has the symmetric key associated with this and then gets the plain text back. Okay, that's all fine and good. The adversary has seen everything that has gone back and forth. The symmetric key after this communication is deleted on both Alice and Bob. Now the question is if, let me see. Yeah, so that's deleted. The question is if the private key of Bob is revealed, and then Heartbleed is one of the most famous ways of revealing a server's private key, can the adversary decrypt this encrypted data? How many of you think yes? How many of you want no, though? You want no, but the answer to this is yes, right? How is this possible that the adversary can now decrypt this payload? As it turns out, there is this message got transmitted, and because the private key that was associated with this public key was used to encrypt the session key, then this session key can be regenerated. Even though Bob and Alice deleted that session key, that green key, you can regenerate that green key because you have the private key from Bob. And now you can use that green key to decrypt this data and get the original plain text. So this does not have forward secrecy. The current compromise of a private key allows you to then decrypt prior messages easily. This is why we don't have, well, we still have most everything is TLS 1.2, but we have TLS 1.3 now to try and get rid of this. Yeah.
Could we say that in this particular situation, if an adversary is unable to get the server's private key, then it's mostly innocuous?
Yes. Yeah. So this is just an additional layer, just in case software bugs happen, which they do. Which is like, oh yeah, Heartbleed, yeah, you can reveal it. Or if there's poor operational security, if someone has some kind of remote code execution on your web server, yeah, it's in the file, the private key is in the file system. I'll just go and dump the etc TLS certs. I forget which directory, but it's in there.
Yeah.
So you can dump the private key any number of ways. But if you do have it compromised, you want to make it hard on the adversary to do anything with that private key. And so we are looking at decrypting prior, assuming the adversary recorded everything, we are trying to make it hard for the adversary to decrypt all of the messages going back in time. Okay, so Heartbleed was a memory overread bug that was used to capture server private keys. And so the obligatory XKCD This is hilarious. This is like one of my favorite XKCDs. I mean, there are a lot of them are my favorite, but this is basically like, hey, let me explain Heartbleed. Hey, server, if you're still there, reply with hat, and hat has 500 letters. And then the server is like, okay, here's hat with 500 bytes or with 497 bytes afterwards, and it would just give it to you, including the server master key. So he even put that in here. Yeah, here's where the server master key is set to 148. So this is the problem, right? Now, if I have the server master key and I was doing TLS 1.2, I'm done. Like all those messages that were captured are now gone. So that's basically what we have. This is the Heartbleed issue, the ability to decrypt all of the messages going back in time. Okay, so what is perfect forward secrecy? It's an approach, and the approach says never use the server's long-term keys for encryption. Only use the public key, private key thing to sign stuff for authenticity only. So the idea is every time you want to establish a shared secret between Alice and Bob, you will generate ephemeral keys. And then you're going to use your long-term key to just sign those, right? Not to actually encrypt any of the keys themselves. And that's what you'll do. So instead, you can do Diffie-Hellman and sign those keys in the key exchange to generate that symmetric key that is ephemeral. And then what you do is you delete the ephemeral key pair after the session ends. Okay, now if the adversary needs to break that communication in the future, they have to basically, because those symmetric keys, the things that we're using, those symmetric keys are gone, as well as there's no encrypted version of these symmetric keys. Now the adversary has to capture individual ephemeral keys before they're deleted in order to decrypt the traffic for that one key or that one session in this case. And this makes it difficult for the adversary to go back in time and delete thousands of these things, right? Because every time you're sending a message, you're generating these ephemeral keys, you're using the signatures to sign them, but you're not actually encrypting them that the other person can monitor. So perfect forward secrecy was added in TLS 1.3 and also added in for wireless protocols, WPA3. Most of us are using WPA2. Eventually, we'll transition over to WPA3, and then you'll know why. Because this is one of the big reasons to transition over to the next thing. Okay, so I'm going to show you an animation. The animation makes more sense than the actual text.
Like how large are these sessions?
You could define it yourself. Like how often do you want to generate the ephemeral key? So these are trade-offs that you can make as a protocol designer. So now you have all the building blocks. Now you can configure how to do this. And we'll talk. So I'm going to talk next about Signal and WhatsApp and how they do these things. They try and do it on every message. So yeah, to make it really hard. So it's end-to-end encrypted and it's all done with ephemeral keys. So yeah, we'll talk about that because we are moving very quickly over to things like Signal and WhatsApp for our messaging at least. Okay, so this is TLS 1.3. This is like a stick figure. This is stick figure 1.3, but this hopefully will get across to you the major change that happened in this protocol. And it was to support perfect forward secrecy. So here we have Alice and Bob have their public key, private key pair, and they have each other's public key, which is over here as well. Okay, so that's the setup. What they do is they generate ephemeral key pairs. So they use their whatever key pair generation thing that they're doing, Diffie-Hellman or whatever, or they're generating the random numbers. Well, I think Diffie-Hellman works in this animation. And so these are completely new, right? And then what they do is they use these public key, private key, ephemeral public key, private key pairs to then do the key exchange protocol. And so in this case, Alice is going to use her long-lived private key to sign the Diffie-Hellman public key in order to send this over to Bob. And Bob is going to do the same thing. He's going to use his long-lived key to sign an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman public key to send over to Alice. And then these things go across, just like in Diffie-Hellman. The adversary sees that this is happening. And then, even though the adversary sees these things, can't generate the green key, the shared key, because of Diffie-Hellman. And so then what Alice and Bob do is they validate that this was signed by Bob for Alice's. And then Bob is going to validate that this key was appropriately signed by Alice using her public key. Okay, so this is the picture. With that, they can generate, using that modular trick that Diffie-Hellman had, they generate this ephemeral shared key. And they're going to use this ephemeral shared key to then take this plain text, encrypt it with that ephemeral key, and send it across. And then Alice is going to take that ephemeral key and decrypt it. Now, at the end, they want to delete everything after their communication. And so that's what happens next. They delete everything. Now, this adversary has these messages. And if the adversary compromises the signing key of Bob, can the adversary decrypt any of these messages? Yeah, you see this thing down here? In order for the adversary, even though the adversary has Bob's signing key, the adversary can't generate this ephemeral green key because there's no way for him. These are the two messages. He can't do anything. This is just signed by this, but all of the other data has now been deleted. He can't observe any of the other data that would have been necessary to generate this symmetric key to decrypt that message. This is perfect forward secrecy. You are forcing the adversary to monitor everything and then to individually break encryption on prior messages. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so I already answered that. Answer is no. Okay, so the private halves of these ephemeral key pairs no longer exist, and so you're not able to decrypt that message. Okay, so I am going to now talk about implementing forward secrecy efficiently. And they're typically done using what are known as ratchets. So what is a ratchet? One of the issues with doing this every single session, so someone mentioned how long are these things done, and it's tunable. But if you did it on every single message, then there are two problems here. The first is that you have an ephemeral key that's kept in memory until the next message exchange is done or is complete. And so you have a window where that thing can be hijacked. So if it's in memory for a long period of time, then the adversary might be able to capture the ephemeral key and then be able to decrypt. You have another problem is that if you're sending a whole bunch of messages back and forth, say you've got this, rapid fire chat going back and forth between you and someone else, it's like, I don't want to have to do this ephemeral key generation and key exchange every single message. That's actually many round trip times followed by a bunch of public key crypto. That's slow. So I don't want to do that. So that becomes a bottleneck. And so what they have gone to implement this is something called a ratchet. So these ratcheting algorithms are implemented so that from an initial key, you call a key derivation function with some input, and you use that to chain the generation, to calculate the generation of the next ephemeral key. And so this is a picture of it, an animation of it, where this ratchet, you see that every tooth in this ratchet is another stage in this key derivation function. You're basically taking an initial configuration of a key and an input, and you're using this to chain the derivation of subsequent ephemeral keys. as you go along. So you have a yellow, then a blue, and then the purple. And so you're not having to do this public key crypto on every step. This is very similar to hash chains. Like if you've taken the blockchain class, you take the output of the hash and make it the input of the next hash, and then that generates a random chain of things that you can use as keys effectively. Similar to the counter mode encryption, if you remember last class, where you're taking a nonce and a counter, and that's generating the stream cipher for the key stream that you're using subsequently. And this is no different. This is basically a key stream where you initialize the top of it using maybe a Diffie-Hellman exchange. And then from then on, it's a deterministic calculation of the output keys. And then you don't have to keep those keys in memory all the time. You can just derive what those keys should be using this chain. Okay, so that's forward secrecy. What if a key is stolen? Well, if this key derivation function is a one-way function, it's hard to reverse. So one-way functions are things that from the output, it's hard to determine what the input was that generated that. So this gives you perfect forward secrecy because then you don't have that data to go backwards. And this assumes you don't have the initial key. The adversary doesn't have the initial key as well.
Once you go to the next two, some of the previous ones deleted.
Yeah. You delete those things. Yeah. So this gives you a form of a forward secrecy, assuming you can't go backwards in the KDF and that you don't have the initial key that started it. Yeah.
You need to send additional information to the prediction.
Yeah, you need some sequence number to make sure that you're in lockstep. The sender and the receiver have to have the same ratchet so that they know where they're at. And then there's a sequence numbering. Yeah, I left out all the details though, because that's all engineering. Not interested in that.
So then if you tell they have to each know how far to ratchet, then how does that increase security if someone could intercept their ratchet?
Oh, okay. So yeah, what if it's a key is stolen? You can't derive the prior if it's just the key. So if you're inside of the algorithm and you know what the initial key was, you don't have forward secrecy. You could regenerate all of those things. But if you just somehow revealed the current key, say there was a heartbleed thing, and you saw this is the current message key, like it's hard for you to go back through the ratchet and generate the prior ones. That's the forward secrecy part of this. But this is a segue. You can derive subsequent keys, right? Like, because this is a ratchet algorithm and you know the current ratchet number. Now I can generate the subsequent ratchet. So this doesn't give you future secrecy. We'll talk about future secrecy in a second. But like, this is an animation of it being done. You have two shared ratchets. So Bob has one sending to Alice. Alice has one sending to Bob. And they each have these pairs of ratchets that have to be in sync. So this is keeping it in sync with sequence numbers. This is the animation for doing that. And so you'll have Alice's send ratcheting with Bob's receive, and then Bob's send ratcheting with Alice's receive. Yeah, do you have a question?
So it seems like they're putting the secrecy on mathematical operations instead of exchanges.
Yep. They have to do an exchange to bootstrap the ratchet. But then the ephemeral keys are done as a deterministic function on the ratchet algorithm rather than, ephemeral key generation and exchange. Like they're not doing Diffie-Hellman on every single key. They're saying Diffie-Hellman on the top one, ratchet from then on. And that gives you a little bit better protection. Okay. So this is Alice's ratchet. Alice's send ratcheting with Bob's receive is the animation I'm showing you. And the animation's pretty good. And this came out of so this is all used in Signal, which is why I'm covering it. And I got this animation. I'm like, okay, this explains it better than I can do in words. And then this is the other directions ratchet. So Bob's send ratchet, sending over to Alice, and then ratcheting Alice's receive ratchet. Okay, Are there questions about this? I'm going to go on to the next part of this. So if I compromise a ratchet key, then I have post-compromise, I have all your messages, right? So how is so if the adversary has managed to obtain a message key, how do I make sure that this adversary cannot reveal future messages that have been encrypted? And so this property, future secrecy, is also known as post-compromise secrecy. And the assumption is that the adversary has broken one message key, but is not sitting there inside of either endpoint. So it's not like sitting there like controlling the ratcheting algorithm. This is just assuming that one message key has been captured. How do I make sure that they can't continue to capture or break the message keys? Now, with the ratcheting, as long as that ratchet has not been reset, the adversary can get the subsequent keys that are being used by just knowing the current key that's being used. And so the idea of future secrecy is to try and self-heal any compromises to make sure those subsequent messages remain secret. And the typical approach is basically key rotation. Let's reinitialize the ratchets using Diffie-Hellman, right? Like we don't want to do Diffie-Hellman every single time, but like every once in a while, let's redo the Diffie-Hellman and then create new ratchets from this. And this will kick the adversary out, assuming the adversary is not in the algorithm itself. And then you got other problems. So this is what Signal uses. So Signal is the underpinning of what WhatsApp does. It's an open source protocol for end-to-end messaging. It does end-to-end encryption, where it's doing the Diffie-Hellman from phone to phone, from endpoint to endpoint. Signal and WhatsApp have no idea what's being sent because it's all done peer-to-peer using Diffie-Hellman. So that's end-to-end encryption. And then to get the future secrecy, to get the forward secrecy, they're doing this ratcheting thing. And so it basically uses what's known as a double ratchet. It's a double ratcheting algorithm. And so what it does is you use you use the KDF, the key derivation function from before, to do perfect forward secrecy. And then what you do is you get future secrecy or post-compromise secrecy by regenerating the initial key used in the symmetric key ratchet. And this is done via a secondary ratchet, secondary Diffie-Hellman ratchet. And so that's basically what happens. You do the Diffie-Hellman exchange to generate the key that drives the next Diffie-Hellman ratchet. And then those things will be used to get your symmetric keys. So you will periodically reset the ratchets that are being used to generate the symmetric keys. And this is a picture of the reset. So periodically, Bob and Alice will be like, okay, I'm going to redo my ratchet. So these are my ratchets so this is what I had before, the sending and the receiving ratchets. Eventually, I need to do Diffie-Hellman on top of this and then reset the state of both of these ratchets with new keys. Yep.
You said the ratchets have to be in sync with each other. How do they do that if like Bob decides he's gonna
So that's part of the bootstrapping. You have to say you do another Diffie-Hellman key. You initiate another Diffie-Hellman key exchange with Alice, and you say this particular ratchet now needs to get reinitialized as soon as the key exchange is successful. Then you'll yeah. Yep. Yeah, I haven't read the spec, so I don't know. It's an implementation detail too, so I don't know how often they reset the top ratchet in Signal. You had a question?
I'll read the slide first.
Okay. Okay, so this forces the adversary to have had all the prior messages and to break the message encryption individually on them, which is bad for the adversary and bad for surveillance. And so that's why the federal government's like, don't know. And this is like, that it's more than just privacy. This is where criminals are like, sweet, untraceable communication. I'm all for that. And this is where policy matters. You're like, what is the greater good for society? And this is where this is a battleground. I would bet that this gets legislated to get controlled, because yeah.
Why is it called an EH ratchet as opposed to just like an EH?
Because they're using Diffie-Hellman to exchange the initial, to set the initial ratchet value. I think that's why they call it a Diffie. See, that they're doing Diffie-Hellman to agree on the value to set the ratchets with.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I have 10 minutes. I have enough time to do security without authority. And this is what SSH does. Because we were talking about TL. Oh, you had a question? Oh.
It may not be relevant, but you talked about the open source WhatsApp signal security. So I guess I've seen that they also have another option, say some kind of double security kind of thing, checkbox.
Oh yeah, I don't know that.
The encryption thing. So how is that different from the actual encryption that they do? Maybe just
Yeah, I'll take that off. Actually, post it on Slack, and then if someone,
just recheck that. Or?
yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the protocol to understand the UI and how it maps to these particular things. Some of these things are going to be regulated so that you're not able to do some of this stuff in certain jurisdictions. That's what I should say. Okay, so security without authority. We just talked about TLS and how it relies on certificate authorities. But we have this thing called SSH, and we're like, we don't have any certificate authorities, do we? Like when I set up my virtual box, I can have SSH into it. It's secure, but who am I trusting? Well, this is, the SSH is what's known as a tofu model, trust on first use. And this was very powerful. Initially, people were like, you can't build security in with this model. But as it turns out, we do a whole bunch of trust bootstrapping on first use. Like you come to this class, very first class, and you see me, and all of a sudden you trust me to be who I am, right? I could just have been playing you the entire quarter, and I'm actually my brother. And you have no idea. It's like, well, you spell your names the same way. It's like, yeah, he could show up and say, man, my brother was totally like taking my class and breaking my car every morning, so I'd never make it to class. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't actually have to sabotage him to actually get the two of us confused. Even when he was the dean, and they were still sending me his messages. So, but implicitly, you all trust me to be who I say I am, and it's just because I just showed up the first day. Okay, so SSH has this model, same model. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to use it to encrypt these remote logins, but I am going to use public key, private key for authentication, even though I don't have a certificate authority signing these things. So how am I going to do this? So as it turns out, when the client opens up a connection to a server, I SSH to a server, the server is going to send its public host key. How can the client be sure that this server is authentic? Because there is no CA that's going to vouch for this server's public host key. So the model that SSH takes is this time of first use or leap of faith authentication. So this was controversial when it was first introduced, but now it's just accepted. The server, the way it works is the server, when you install a Linux operating system, for example, the server is going to pre-generate its own new host keys. So a private public key pair on installation, and it stores these keys in etc SSH. So you can pull out the server's public key and the private key from that directory. And then the establishment of a host key in your client is done on a first come, first trusted basis. So then the client initiates this connection with the server for the very first time. The server is going to send its public key back to the client. And if the client has never seen this server or this key before, the client is, well, so the client figures out whether it hasn't seen this thing before by looking up this database of known hosts. And if the client has never seen this key or this server before, then it will ask the user whether to accept the key and continue or reject the key. And then you'll be like, yes, accept it. I intentionally did this. I believe this host to be, this is the first time I've connected to the host. And so I will now trust that this IP address now has this public key associated with it. And then I store that in known hosts. And then upon accepting, it's there so that I can associate this IP address with this public key from then on. And that's stored in known hosts. Okay. And then continues connecting. Okay, so then you get the password prompt and then you're good to go. The host is automatically authenticated on subsequent connections. So then you're going to use that to, you're going to do a challenge response when you connect up with it next time to make sure that that thing hasn't changed. If it has changed, say that server reinstalled the operating system or someone's in the middle trying to hijack your SSH connection, this is going to get flagged as a potential attack because the key material changed. And you'll get a message that looks like this. You'll be like, hey, this host key changed. You either have to delete that thing from known hosts if you want to continue to connect, or you just have to stop connecting with this. And this is how you determine whether or not that remote location has been changed or hijacked, whether your connection's been hijacked, the thing got reinstalled, and so on. With your Kali VM, if you have reinstalled your Kali VM and it comes back up on the same IP address, you're going to get this error. And so you're going to need to delete the entry out of your known hosts to get around this. Okay, so then assuming this connection is made, then the next thing that will happen is you'll negotiate a session key. So you can use Diffie-Hellman to do the key exchange. This is as before. This is a picture of the key generation protocol in SSH. And then you can see there's some algorithms that getting, which algorithms can I use? Which protocol am I using? And then there's basically a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So we just talked about exchanging P and G and then doing this to generate this, this key. Okay, so then the next step is the server's gonna wanna authenticate the client. And so then the client can do whatever it needs to. And the mechanism for client authentication is typically done based on server configuration. So you could use username and password. You could use a challenge response. You could do a security key, a YubiKey. You could do a network-based authentication. So if you're in the enterprise, Linux can be set up to do Kerberos or LDAP, where it remotely asks a directory server to auth you. Or you could establish it via a public key for the client. And so this is what you did to set up your repository. In this class, you generated a key, a public key, private key pair, and then you stored it in IDRSA and IDRSA.pub. And then what you did was you appended IDRSA.pub into GitLab. Or if you wanted to SSH into Linux Lab, then you would, in this directory, append that public key of the client to Linux Lab's, your home directory on Linux Lab in SSH authorized keys. And then from then on, this is what you would do. You would then SSH from your laptop into Linux Lab, say. The server is going to send a challenge response. You're going to encrypt the challenge with your private key, send it back to the server. The server has your public key in authorized keys. We'll try and decrypt it. And if it decrypts back to be the message that the server sent you, that gets you your SSH. And with that, I'll take questions. Yep.
So I thought the goal was that the public key can encrypt it, but it can't decrypt the message.
Signing. So in this, wait, did I have the notation wrong? Encrypts it with their private key. So yeah, so then the public, you put the public key over on the server and then you encrypted it with your private key. Now, again, you didn't sign it anything, you encrypted it in this case, this particular value. And that's what SSH does.
So if the public key is like readily known,
So yeah, if the public key is known, but only the private key can encrypt. So this is using the public key, private key. So the private key can be used to either encrypt a piece of data or sign it. And so it was just being used in this context to encrypt it. And it's the same, it's equivalent actually. The signing and the encrypting in this case.